Good morning, everyone. My name is City Councilor at Large Michael Flaherty, Chair of the Government Operations Committee, and today we are here to discuss docket 1425, message and order authorizing the acceptance of the provisions of Section 3 of Chapter 64N of the Mass General Laws, which allows a municipality that accepts that section to impose a local sales tax of up to 3% upon the sale or transfer of marijuana or marijuana products by a recreational marijuana dealer. The order also sets the rate of the local sales tax on marijuana at the maximum allowed 3% rate. This matter was sponsored by Mayor Martin Walsh and referred to the Committee on Government Operations back on November the 15th. Section 3 of Chapter 64N of the Mass General Laws, as recently amended by Section 13 of Chapter 55 of the Acts of 2017, after the legalization of recreational marijuana in 2016, provides municipalities with the option of adopting a local sales tax on recreational marijuana sales. The maximum local sales tax allowed under Mass is at 3%. Docket 1425 says Chapter 5, but it should be reflected in everyone's notes and on public record that it's actually Chapter 55. And docket 1425 is in order to accept the local sales tax option and also to set the local tax rate on retail marijuana and marijuana projects in the City of Boston at 3%. Although there are not yet any marijuana retailers in the City of Boston, the Mayor's transmittal letter recommends setting the tax rate now in order to be able to tax such sales in the event that a retailer becomes officially licensed in Boston. So we're joined today by my colleagues, City Councilor Frank Baker, City Councilor Anissa Savi-George, and City Councilor Mark Siomo. And we're also joined today by Justin Sterrett of the City of Boston Budget Director. So you have the floor if you want to make some introductory comments, and then we can maybe go back and forth. I know there are also industry representatives that are here that may at some point want to come down as either part of a panel or offer public testimony and give us their thoughts. So welcome, and you have the floor.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me, Councilor Flaherty, Councilor Siomo, Councilor George, and Councilor Baker. As you mentioned, my name is Justin Sterrett. I'm the Budget Director for the City of Boston. I'm here to sort of offer testimony in support of 1425 that will authorize the city to accept and set the tax rate at 3% for recreational marijuana. This is a reaction to the recently passed state law, Chapter 55 of the Acts of 2017, that produced regulations and the law that's governing the new recreational marijuana ballot question. We believe that setting the tax rate at 3% is a prudent move for the city. We are starting to look at what this is going to cost as a part of an enforcement, regulations, public health, education as part of the city budget for FY19. And we think even at 3% that the revenue the city will receive will only partially support those operations. We've taken a look at some other cities that have more mature markets, Denver being sort of a pretty good proxy for what the city has in terms of population. Boston's obviously a little bit more dense than Denver. And we think that they spend upwards of $5 to $6 million a year in the regulation of enforcement of marijuana. So setting the tax rate will sort of give us some of the resources we need to allocate for that, but we don't think that it'll even be enough to cover all the costs that the city will incur. Setting the tax rate now is important because as we get into the FY19 budget process, we want to make sure that we sort of refine what we think the estimates are going to be on that. And then secondly, for the businesses that are sort of looking to open up in Boston, we think it's important to set the tax rate so that they know what to expect on the local level. The amount that we receive in FY19 will depend really largely on three things: the speed in which the state CCC, Cannabis Control Commission, offers licenses. They have set a deadline of March 15th to put their regulations and then begin accepting applications for beginning sales in July 1st of 2018. Also, it's going to take, obviously, businesses finding locations and zoning and understanding what their needs are going to be. And then finally, understanding that there will be an additional process to figure out where to locate these, or I'm assuming will be a public process both here and sort of in the community to understand what the impacts are going to be. So we think it's an important step to get the ball rolling. We'll obviously be having additional conversations, as this process develops over the next few months, and we think that setting the tax rate now will set expectations for both the businesses and what the city needs in terms of enforcement, regulation, and health. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Well, thank you, Justin, first and foremost, for participating. 63% of the citywide of Boston voters said yes to recreational marijuana, so lots of questions now loom with respect to how much revenue does the city estimate to be regenerated. So I know we're a little premature in terms of we're getting the tax in place before retailers are up and running, but any guesstimates with respect to what we're looking at potentially? And then also, is there any thoughts behind what that revenue will be used for?
Sure, absolutely. So Colorado has a $1.3 billion a year business in recreational marijuana. We think that when the market is fully up and running here in Massachusetts, we could see numbers not maybe as high, but something close to that. Boston represents obviously the largest population density area. So thinking about that as terms of what we might be able to get in terms of revenue, we think somewhere between 2 and 3 million in the first year. Obviously, it's going to take time for the shops to get up and running, more shops coming online. The state recently at the consensus revenue hearing last week put a ballpark figure between 40 and 80 million in statewide collections on this. We obviously only represent about 3% of that. Their tax rate is 17%. So we think somewhere between 2 and 3 million is a reasonable estimate for the first year, but we'll be working to refine that over the next few months. As far as costs, I think definitely enforcement and regulation are going to be the top two things that come into play initially. And that's both going to be costs at BPD or, other departments that are sort of regulating and enforcing the zoning laws. I think we'll have to work with departments over the next few months to figure out what the process will be to fund some of these things. But the money that we'll be receiving as part of the sales tax will go into the general fund and will be available for appropriation through the budget process in the upcoming year.
Very good. We've also been joined by my colleague, City Councilor Matt O'Malley. And in order of how my colleagues arrived, Chair recognizes Councilor Anise Wasabi. George, any questions of Justin?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Justin, for being here. I have just two questions, because the general law allows us to impose a local tax of up to 3%, and the mayor is recommending that we're at 3%. Can you just talk a little bit about how that decision was made as opposed to doing 1 or 2 or 2.5?
Sure. I'd say 3% is not going to be enough as is, so I think that we wanted to maximize the resources that we have available to regulate this industry moving forward. I think I mentioned before, Denver spends $6 to $10 million a year on programs. 3%, which I said before was roughly $2 to $3 million a year, maybe that won't cover half of what Denver spends on regulation and enforcement. So we think that setting the tax rate at the maximum amount right now, and then kind of seeing what the revenue brings in is the best approach at this point.
And then is there an opportunity at all to designate that specific revenue, that 3% that's collected, towards specific programs as opposed to, or specific funds as opposed to directly into the general fund?
Sure. So the way I understand it now, the 3% will go into the general fund. We can certainly talk and look at priorities throughout the budget process. There will be a separate process for community mitigation fees. So essentially, retailers, dispensaries will enter into a host agreement with the city, and at that time we'll negotiate with them an opportunity to impose an additional fee or agreement with the retailer to collect another 3% on top of that. That will go potentially into a separate fund that we would then sort of dedicate towards very specific mitigation issues around that specific retailer. So I think we'll sort of continue to monitor it, but I think there will be more than enough costs to go around than what the tax will cover.
All right, that's it for me, Chair. Thank you.
Councilor Baker?
Hi, Justin. How are you today?
Good, how are you?
Good. Can you talk a little, so you think the costs are going to be more administrative?
Yeah, I would say administrative and getting the program up and running, and I think
Maybe you can talk about when you say get the program up and running,
Sure.
what would that program be?
Sure. So that'll be to be determined, I guess, through the zoning process and the process of how the shops actually get licensed and put into different places. I think we're still working through that process as a city. Some of that will depend on what the CCC's final regulations are and sort of what the restrictions are, how to get them in the right places, and then enforcement on both the retail side and the homegrown side. I think something gets a little bit less publicity is that individuals now be able to grow plants in their own home, so understanding the enforcement around that. And I think most of the costs will be either administrative or, enforcement driven.
So that would be police costs we're talking about there?
Yeah, I think that's definitely a possibility. I think it's probably a little bit too early to say, overtime hours or specific cost, but I think that that's definitely a location that we'll be looking at.
And have there been talks about what potential, like of the dispensaries, what the police costs may be in and around a dispensary? Is there any way to, no real way to determine that?
Yeah, we haven't gotten that far in the conversations yet. I think we haven't received any applications, obviously, so we haven't really begun that part of the process of understanding what the costs are gonna be.
And I think it's gonna be a while before we're getting any money, because the dispensaries that are opening up are all medical. We're not gonna tax them. The retail, I mean, I think it's a little out before we get any retail.
Yeah, I think we definitely have that same fear. That's why I think we're trying to be very conservative
Because
with
we're
the
gonna need to
estimates.
be, your program is gonna need to be up and running before we're collecting anything,
Yep, absolutely.
because it's gonna be all medical first.
Yep, and
To be able to allow the business to grow and, you know, so people can understand the business. I think that it's gonna be difficult to generate tax money for a couple of years, I think.
yeah, definitely. That's why we look for guidance from the State Department of Revenue, because they're putting a $40 to $80 million estimate on what they think they're going to collect for next year. So I think we're trying to be as conservative as possible, but still trying to live within that.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes City Councilor Mark Siomo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Hi, Justin. So who will be negotiating the host agreements?
It's a great question. I don't think we have finalized that exactly. I think there'll be probably input from several different departments in the city. I think it'll kind of depend on what the process is for zoning and sort of citing the facilities. I don't think we have had enough of those conversations yet, and that'll sort of depend a little bit, like I said before, on the regs that come out of the CCC, and we'll sort of continue to work on that probably as a group effort, but not a specific department in mind right now.
Is it possible to add a local option, so to speak, in a host agreement? And not call it a local option or call it something else, but a percentage, because to the point that you made earlier, where we may not have enough to actually pay for the cost of staff to inspect and regulate. And when we went to Denver, you know, the city of Denver gets excise taxes and all these extra taxes, and they provide a lot of money for education. And I just hope that we can get enough revenue to regulate, but also educate. I think it's really important, especially with a new industry coming in. And I would also say that, you know, the state, hopefully, and I don't know if you know this or not at this point, are they going to be offering grants or anything for those kinds of programs that we obviously don't seem to have enough money to do, and it's really important.
Sure. So I'll answer the first part on the host agreement first. So in the host agreements, we're allowed to negotiate for upwards of 3% of their total sales.
Okay.
And that would be sort of dedicated towards specific mitigation costs. And I think the important thing to note on that is that agreement sunsets after, or the financial components of those agreements sunset after 5 years. So we want to be really careful that we don't, you know, have costs that will extend past those 5 years. We really want to make sure that we're controlling whatever we're getting from the sort of host agreements to only go towards a sort of one-time cost that won't extend past 5 years. As far as grants from the state, obviously they have a much bigger piece of the pie when it comes to this. They'll have resources, I think, available for education and grants and stuff like that, but I think they're going through their own internal process right now to figure out exactly what their, kind of to Councilor Baker's question earlier, is they don't know how much revenue exactly they're gonna have yet, so I think that they're still sort of working through that process.
Right. Okay. And one final comment, I guess. One of the things that I saw to be very important was the kind of monthly meetings that several departments convened: police, fire, inspectional services, all of the various departments that not only regulate but enforce. And one of the problems that Denver, I think, had was explosions from people growing their own. So I just hope that we look at this holistically and some of those impacts and how we're going to deal with those. So thank you. Thanks, Justin.
Chair recognizes City Councilor Matt O'Malley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Justin. Great to be with you. Just a couple of questions, and I apologize, I missed the beginning of this, but this up to 3% sale is, municipalities get to decide this. Is that a flat rate for all new recreational dispensaries, or is that sort of on a case-by-case basis?
So the sales tax piece will apply to all recreational retailers. We did have the opportunity to do up to 3%. The way that it works, the state collects as you would regular sales tax, and
Yep.
then on a quarterly basis, they'll remit it to us as part of the general fund revenue that we have.
Okay, and that's on top of the state's established tax rate. Has that been determined yet?
Yeah, so they have a 20% kind of all-in tax rate, 17% of which is state-driven, and that's 10% on a state marijuana excise tax, the 6% sales tax, and then our 3% local option, puts an all-in rate of about 20%.
Okay, 3% local option. And it's, it's funny, I know Councilor Baker had a hearing earlier today. I've got several medicinal dispensaries that seem to be moving at a quicker pace because of the agreement that we've been able to work with them that it would be medicinal only and not recreational. But obviously this is coming, and the state legislature is looking for this summer, I believe, to sort of have their final results. Has the city begun sort of creating zoning regulations, or at least an overview for recreational?
So I think we're definitely working on it. We don't have sort of a final product to share with you. I think there will be additional sort of conversations in the public purview that will inform that decision. I think we're still waiting on some of the final regulations from the state control board, which will really inform a lot of the decisions on what we can and can't do in terms of zoning.
Understood. But I am hopeful that this body will play a role with you when, a draft is available and working for our input. Definitely. I mean, people often have to jump through hoops to put a dormer on their home, so I would hope that there would be similar protections for this. And then similarly, and this may actually be a question for the chairman, under your leadership, I believe we did establish some zoning regulations that you could not have more than one facility, be it recreational or medicinal, within half a mile of another.
Yeah, that's correct. That's what the text amendment to the zoning code, creating a buffer, a half-mile buffer for medicinal only, meaning you can't have a medicinal within a recreational. We could not expand to recreational because it hadn't passed at that time, so.
And that's the law, that exists, so the regulations that the city finally does will obviously be part and parcel with that.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, and we would probably be discussing an additional text amendment to include medicinal at some point.
Recreational.
Recreational, thank
Okay.
you.
That's fair enough. And then I guess with the CCC, has the city been, does the city have a seat at the table in terms of that outside of our, our reps and senators?
That's a great question. The CCC has an advisory board with, I think, somewhere like 20 to 30 members, and I believe that there's a representative of Mass Municipal Association on there, but I don't know if the city has a direct person sitting on their council.
Okay, that would be helpful if we could get that. That's all I really have. I know I'm getting more into sort of the zoning weeds, and this is more in terms of the revenue piece, but, obviously if this could, if done well and done right and done, sort of sensitively, this could obviously allow for significant revenue for the city, which we all agree we need. Any idea what the number would be in terms, or I guess it's too premature to say?
Sure. So I think right now we're looking at somewhere between $2 and $3 million in the first year, but it really depends on how, exactly like you said, how quickly the CCC gets up and running, how quickly the retailers get cited, how quickly, they can start growing and selling. We think $2 to $3 million is a reasonable estimate for the first year, with growth potential as the market continues to grow.
And is there any concern, again, this is somewhat tangentially related, any concern that sort of federal policy on recreational marijuana may obviously hinder changes in Massachusetts and other states?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a fear, on a lot of federal policy generally, but this could definitely, if things were to change on the federal level, we'd have to react to that somehow in the state. We'd have to see what the type of change would be at the federal level. We'll see.
And as I understand, to that point, as it stands now, an individual can obviously, for medicinal marijuana, can pay, insurance won't cover it, but could pay for them, or I believe they don't cover it, perhaps there'd be exceptions. They could pay with cash or a debit card, but not a credit card.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on sort of the financing of both the retail side and but I do know that retailers and growers do struggle with the banking aspect of it. I think that in Denver there's a sort of niche banking market that has grown out of the industry there that sort of fills some of the gaps that the traditional banking system doesn't have. But I think it'll be determined how this exactly will roll out. I think we're all learning at the same time.
Indeed. Well, thank you, Justin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilor. Justin, if I could just ask you to stay with us a little longer. I see my friend Jim Borgasani and Will Luzier here. They played key roles in the Yes on 4 campaign back in 2016. So whether or not they have any specific questions, they may want to come down, and if we can engage. So I see Jim and Will. Welcome to join us. So, good morning, gentlemen. Good morning, Jim and Will, and if you could just state your name and any affiliation you have for the record, and then you have the floor to ask us any questions or ask Justin here any questions you have or comments on the tax.
Appreciate that, Councilor Flaherty. Thank you, Chairman, for the opportunity to address you. Thank you to the rest of the councilors for that opportunity also. I don't have any questions of the Revenue Department. I don't have any prepared remarks. I just want to address a couple of things that have come up during the testimony. The first is...
Just state your name, full name.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Will Luzier. I am the political director of the Marijuana Policy Project and a resident of Alston-Brighton. Of Alston, I should say, not Brighton. I wanted to talk a little bit about the local host agreements. Those will be negotiated with each of the retail facilities, and they are the cost, the payment of those for those local host agreements is tied to the cost of that facility in that location, and it can be up to 3%. Now, I don't know exactly how the city of Boston is going to determine what each facility costs in each neighborhood, but that's probably something that the Revenue Department will have to struggle with. So it's the opportunity to reap revenue of up to 6%, so 3% for the local host agreement and 3% for the retail sales tax. The tax is actually 20%, 3% local option, 6.25% for the sales tax, as long as that is in effect, and 10.75% is the excise tax. And that money will go into the Marijuana Regulation Fund, and the fund will fund the administration of the state program and several other opportunities, including prevention funding for folks who use the Strategic Prevention Fund framework, the Strategic Prevention Framework for costs of training local law enforcement and for costs that may be incurred in making sure that there is equity in the program. So all of those things are outlined in Chapter 55 of the Acts of 2017 that will allow for all of those costs to be administered by the Cannabis Control Commission. But there's no formula for exactly how much will go to each activity. There is priority for the administration of the program first, obviously, and then the Cannabis Control Commission will have the opportunity, with the direction of the legislature, to apportion the rest of that money to those activities. Councilor Siomo mentioned issues with regard to home growing in Colorado and explosions. Actually, those explosions probably happened not because people were home growing, but because they were home extracting. And there are several extraction methods, including using volatile liquids. And sometimes those explosions happen, but the legislation and the initiative both prohibited the use of any volatile gas that has a flash point of over 100 degrees. So those kinds of explosions would be prohibited, and obviously that would be an issue that would be addressed by local police.
So then, Will, is it safe to say, so it's from the 3% sales tax, that's revenue that we generated will go right to the local municipality, in this instance, Boston?
That's right.
But based on your explanation of that strategic prevention
Framework.
Is it fair to say that additional resources potentially could come to the city of
Yes,
Boston based on host
absolutely.
agreements?
Absolutely,
And
and
the host agreements
additional resources also for, well, no, because the money that, the 10.75% that goes into the marijuana regulation fund will be available to communities that use the strategic prevention framework, and almost all of the prevention activities that go on with regard to alcohol and drugs and tobacco prevention, particularly around youth. Almost every community uses that strategic prevention framework. It's the framework that's recommended by the Substance Abuse Administration of the state. And so those monies will be available to localities that use that.
Great, thank you. Morning, Jim, anything to add?
Hi, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Jim Borghesani, Duxbury, Massachusetts. I just wanted to add the local host agreement under Chapter 55. Nothing says that you can't renegotiate that host agreement after 5 years. So it ends after 5 years, but nothing says that, again, you can renegotiate it. It's just a term.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Any questions of my colleagues of either Will or Jim at this time? Chair recognizes Councilor Matt O'Malley.
Well, Jim, thank you. Just that I wasn't aware of that, Jim. So if, Acme marijuana shop opens up, there's an agreed upon host agreement, 5 years lapse, what then is the leverage? Does it go back before the local
I would think it
governing
would go
board?
back before whoever the
Like a
body
zoning
is that
commission?
ultimately negotiated the first agreement, or however that may alter. But whoever is in charge then of negotiating agreements, you would renegotiate that
Interesting.
agreement if the city wished to.
Yeah, but if they didn't, then it would just lapse. So
Yes.
the sort of oversight would remain with the city, but
Correct.
obviously.
That's our understanding of the legislation, yeah.
That's helpful, thank you. Thank you.
And then just saying, so the strategic prevention, is that voluntary? Just so the host community has to say, hey, I want to get into the strategic prevention stream, and if so, then these are the benefits that flow. If a community says, no, we don't want to be part of the strategic prevention, is that even an option?
Well, most all of the prevention efforts that are active now in cities and towns across Massachusetts, most all of them use the strategic prevention framework. I would be surprised if the prevention efforts here in the city of Boston don't use that strategic prevention framework. So to the extent that that those funds are available, they would be grant funding to those organizations that provide prevention education.
Great, okay.
And one other thing I just wanted to make sure that everyone knew. Most large cities and towns, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland when marijuana became legal there, Colorado when marijuana became legal there, have been developing local offices of marijuana policy. So, for instance, the city of San Francisco just approved, and they're going online with adult use retail in January 1st of next year. They have just signed off on, the city of San Francisco has just signed off on their local regulations through their Office of Marijuana Policy, and the mayor signed off on it. So that's always a possibility for the city of Boston to do also.
Very good. Thank you. And I've asked to join both Michael Ross and Frank Perullo, representing folks in the recreational marijuana representatives, if you will. So you've heard the testimony from the administration, also from lead sponsors of question 4. So if you have any thoughts or comments on this idea, and we can ask you guys some questions.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the council. My name is Mike Ross. I'm an attorney at the law firm of Prince Lobel, and I have and do represent several companies in presently medical marijuana. I had the privilege of working through 4 applications in Boston alone. And just recently, previous to this hearing, we were working on one of those in the Dorchester proposal. And as a matter of fact, one of my clients is in the audience here who's seeking to open in the Back Bay and was recently approved at the Zoning Board of Appeal. And just as an attorney working in this space, I'm a real estate attorney. I do other work other than cannabis industry, regular commercial permitting and that type of work. But more and more, this seems to be a growing area. And I would just like to say that I've reached out to my clients, and as a practitioner in this space, I would like to put my full support behind this initiative. I think it's responsible, and I think it warrants the approval of this body, if I may say so. And I think it's very telling of this industry that the fact that I would think almost all of the people within this industry wanting to support a tax on their industry, I think goes to show you the type of people who are affiliated with this industry. I don't think everyone's going to agree, but I would say the majority of this industry would be in support of this type of proposal, and I wanted to speak in support of it today.
Thank you, Michael. Frank, any additional comments?
For sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, fellow councilors. I'm here, Frank Perullo, representing Mayflower Medicinals. Mayflower was approved last year now, I believe, for a site over in Harvard Ave in Alston. And I'm here on behalf of John Henderson, the CEO, to read his comments on the tax matter, if you will. My name is John Henderson, and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Mayflower Medicinals. Mayflower has received a provisional certificate of approval to operate a registered marijuana dispensary at 230 Harvard Ave in the Alston-Brighton neighborhood, although I should say the Alston neighborhood, according to Will. I'm sure Councilor Sioma will appreciate that. I write on behalf of Mayflower Medicinals in support of docket 1425, a message in order authorizing the City of Boston to impose a local sales tax of 3% upon the sale or transfer of marijuana or marijuana products by a recreational marijuana retailer. The City of Boston will collect significant tax revenues that can be used to enhance the lives of Bostonians by allocating resources towards education, safety initiatives, infrastructure improvements, and other vital programs that make Boston a great city to live, work, and raise a family. Mayflower looks forward to working collaboratively with the city to develop thoughtful, responsible regulations surrounding the adult use of cannabis in the City of Boston. One additional comment, I think the comparisons to Colorado are always great, and they are, the best data points we have. But I think it's worth noting that there are over 300, I think Will and Jim could probably note the exact amount, but there are over 300 dispensaries in Colorado, so the cost to enforce and inspect and all of the things you do as a government body may be quite, I think, significantly more than you're going to see in Boston, with the Flaherty rule being in place of the half-mile rule. That's what we in the industry refer to it as, Mr. Chairman. It's the Flaherty rule. It's named by Mike Ross. But I do think it's interesting to note that there was over 300. I can't see there being more than 15, 20, 25. We can negotiate this now, but I do believe it's important to note that I think cost, frankly, you have one right now operating in downtown, and what has been the cost so far to operate or to enforce, inspect, and overall manage that? I don't think there's been much more than the average business that sites anywhere. So I'd be remiss, I think, not saying that that's a salient data point to compare.
Very good. Does the Flaherty rule come with gummy bears or brownies or anything? Any questions of my colleagues of representatives from the industry at this time? Very good. I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you. To be here to testify. If any folks here wish to offer public testimony or have any questions of our panel, you may come down and do so now or forever hold your peace. Seeing and hearing no desire.
I have one other,
Sure.
actually two other comments.
Sure. Fire away.
First of all, we certainly support a tax on retail marijuana. The initiative had a tax of 2%. The legislature, in their wisdom, increased it to 3%. We actually thought it made more sense to allow local option for more than 3%, but that was the legislature's call.
But
So
you're saying, so initially when you started off on your campaign, you sort of forecast a 2%.
That's right.
And the legislature sort of accepted that and then bumped it up a little bit more.
That's right.
So from the get-go, right out of the gate, you guys were supportive of this?
Certainly supportive of a
Tax.
local tax.
Right,
And the second thing, I wanted to address Councilor Baker's comment about police enforcement. There are some small studies that indicate that security around retail marijuana establishments is so strict and so strong that the crime rate around those localities goes down because there are cameras and there are security officers and perhaps even police officers on detail at those locations, so that the crime rate actually goes down in those areas where adult use retail establishments are located.
Yeah, so I was looking to see if I could pry out of Justin what the police are asking, what they're going to be asking for, if they have any sort of projections on that, because I tend to agree with you. Dan Linsky's gonna be doing security at the proposed place in Dorchester, and I can see that improving the quality of life around there if we have people like that, so, thank
Right.
you.
I know that the facility that was just approved in the Back Bay by the Zoning Board of Appeals, they've indicated they're going to have a police detail that is on the Commonwealth Mall, just to make sure that there aren't people loitering there, even though it's a few blocks from their location, so.
Very good. Well, that'll conclude the hearing on docket 1425. So Justin, thank you again for your time and attention and your professional input. And then obviously, thanks, and good to see old friends Jim Borghesani and Will Luzier participating in this panel, as well as former colleague Councilor Ross and Frank Brullo. So with respect to this, my intention as chair of Government Ops is to have a committee report turned around pretty quickly. Our last formal session will be Wednesday, so I expect that working with the administration, we'll have something before the council for a vote on this coming Wednesday. So with that, docket 1425, message and order authorizing acceptance of provision of Section 3 of Chapter 64N of the Mass General Laws, which allows the municipality to accept that, section will impose a local tax up to 3%. The Committee on Government Operations is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.